Howdy bubs and welcome back. Today we'll be jumping into our next step for GameMaker, and in this video we're going to be covering how to create a spawner for the enemies. So that way that our enemy can, rather than just being one instance chasing us around the room, there can in fact be multiple instances of the enemy in our world, and they can progressively spawn in based off of how you decide to design it. So let's go ahead and jump in. We can right click and we're going to create a new object. This object is going to be obj_spawner. The spawner object, I am not going to include any type of sprite. It doesn't need a sprite for our purposes. Some of you may decide to design your thing differently. You can mess around with that as you see fit. This is how I'm going to introduce it. We're going to add in a create event. And this is where, based off of what you want to do with your game, will determine what you place in here. But this will simply initialize certain values. First, you need to decide whether you want your game to run with just new enemy every X seconds, or new wave of enemies every seconds, or every X seconds, or after wave clear. Let me move this over. Also, if you want to increase the font size, you actually can just press, I believe it's F8, yeah, function key 8. This will increase the size of the font. Do not try to zoom in. That does not make it look good. You can always hit this to recenter or fit your zoom correctly. So here are two different ways. I'm going to show both of them, but I believe I'm going to end up selecting this one because I think it looks a little cooler. But let's go ahead and do just new enemy every X seconds. Well, what is X? Let's do spawn timer. In this case, for the spawn timer, I'm going to have this trigger every, let's see, 3 seconds. So seconds. Unfortunately, the program does not use seconds, it uses steps. And so since I know I want to have 3 seconds, your game runs at 60 steps per second, so it is roughly 60 times 3, which will give us 180. You have to do some basic math. So this will be 180 steps. 180. So we're going to go and specify, we're going to have new alarm 0 that will trigger in 180 seconds. I'm going to go in and create a new alarm. And so here, this will spawn enemy. We will instance underscore create layer. And remember how we have these layers over here? Well, I'm going to specify, let me add an enemy layer. Rename enemy, enemy out of here into here. Actually, we don't need the enemy, we just need a spawner. Actually, I'll leave an enemy in there just for testing purposes. So I'm going to say xran and yran. We're going to calculate those in a moment. In the enemy layer, now we're going to spawn obj_enemy. So where will the enemy spawn? We can create a variable since it'll only be used in this calculation. Here we can have I random range and specify a lower bound and an upper bound for our xrand value. Well, I want my lower bound to be, let's say, the left side of the screen, which would be 0. And I want my upper bound to be the right side of the screen, which will be room_width. We can do the exact same thing for the y value. and this will be instead room height. Now, right now we do not put any calculations or checks to make sure that the enemy does not somehow spawn underneath the player. That will be something we address in the future, but for the time being we can just get a very simple spawner working. And most importantly, make sure the alarm is turned back on based off of our spawn timer. Let's go ahead and test this. So there we go, within 3 seconds we had a new enemy. Another 3 seconds, another enemy. So that's a very simple, basic one. It simply is checking to see if we have 180 steps pass, and it creates a new enemy. You can add far more details into this to get this to be more responsive to our game. Now, the other alternate setup, this is enemy spawner, and this will just have us spawn in. You can keep this as OBJ spawner, it's whatever you finalize it. I'm going to add to this so I know which version this is. This is enemy spawner, and this is just based off of time. Every certain number of units, new enemy comes in. That's it. I am going to duplicate this. You do not need to duplicate this because you'll figure out which one you want to use. There's also enemy spawner, and this will be wave. So now in the wave, in the waves create event, I'm going to have enemy total, and this is going to be set equal to 0. Enemy in the wave, you can specify it to some value. I'm going to start it off with, let's say, 5 get spawned per wave. And then this will be how many we receive in a wave. So in this case, I want to go for 10 seconds. So that would be 600. Let's just do that. And we have the spawn timer trigger at that time. So notice, all we changed was this. Alarm 0 in here specifies this and creates it. I can loop this portion of the code based off the number of enemies I want spawned in. So I can simply place this inside of a for loop. For I is equal to 0, for bar I is equal to 0, while I is less than enemies per wave I++. Indent that over, close this. I'm going to go back into my room and I'm going to remove the instance of the timer based one and throw in our wave. So now after about 10 seconds, 600 steps, we should eventually get 5 enemies to spawn into our world. And there we go. We had 5 enemies spawn in. Within 10 seconds, we should receive 5 more. So this one gets that job done very nicely. But what if I also wanted to keep track of, rather than having these spawn in at a timer, we spawn in whenever the player has wiped out the wave, and every wave the number of enemies increases. So let's go ahead and duplicate this. And then a wave, this is OBJ, spawner, wave, progressive. So let's go to this object, create, and so we follow the same logic. Enemy total is 0. Enemies per wave starts at 1. And now we don't actually need a timer. We can remove this portion. And instead, now we're going to make use of enemy total. Change our alarm to be a step event. Every step, we check to see if enemies total is equal to 0, meaning that we don't have any enemies, then we trigger the following. Increase the enemy per wave to be equal to be plus equals 1. The wave increases by 1. Now we have to keep track of how many enemies we actually have. So in our instance create layer, we are creating a new enemy object. So let's go to the enemy object and get it to interact with the enemy total value. And so this is initializing things. So referencing obj spawner wave progressive dot enemy total plus equals 1. We're going to increase it by 1. We have just created a new enemy, so increase our total by 1. And I'm going to add an event for destroy. Whenever we delete an enemy, we have to reference again the obj underscore spawner wave progressive dot enemy total minus equals 1. We decrease it by 1. So when we create one, we increase it by 1. Whenever we delete one, we decrease it by 1. Now we're keeping track of this. Now every time the enemy is deleted, it's kept track of in our spawner. Our spawner then knows, okay, I have 0 enemies, spawn more 1. And the next wave will increase by 1. For this to work, we have to now remove this enemy from the room and add in one little chunk of code over here. When our projectile collides with an enemy, it destroys itself. And then we just have instance underscore destroy, and now we're to specify other. Other in this context refers to the obj enemy, the specific enemy that our projectile has made contact with. Now go back into the room, make sure you have deleted the other enemy that's in here, and you remove the old spawner. Now we're only using the new spawner. Now it automatically spawned one enemy in. Whenever that enemy dies, we saw it spawn 2 in. Whenever these die, 3 come in. And then now 4. Then next it'll be 5. And voila. Now it progressively gets harder. You can play around with these mechanics and modify it to suit your needs, your desires, and whatever game design you have in mind. Again, you can use any of these 3. I just think the progressive one is probably the more interesting one. But ultimately, it is up to you. It is your game. If you have any questions or need any assistance, just let me know. Otherwise, everyone, have a good one.
I just wanted to say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Shout out to my bad bubs, my top 5, my day ones. Y'all have always been there for me. Next up, my baby bubs, the next 5. I always love y'all's support. And finally, for everyone else, any little bit helps. Thank you to all my basic bubs for supporting me along my journey. If you want to continue receiving notifications, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell button.